passengers mocked a poor single dad in first class, until the pilot walked over and saluted him. The woman in seat 2A wrinkled her nose before the plane had even left the gate. "Is that man lost?" she whispered to her husband loud enough for 3 rows to hear. He was standing in the aisle, holding his daughter's hand. His jacket was faded at the elbows. His boots were scuffed, laced with a knot instead of proper eyelets. He didn't look like he belonged in first class. He looked like he'd wandered in from a different life entirely. His daughter, maybe 7 years old, clutched a stuffed rabbit missing one ear. "Excuse me," a flight attendant said, stepping toward him with a tight smile. "Sir, economy boarding is through the other door." He held up his ticket without a word. "Seat 3C, first class, paid in full." She checked it twice before her smile turned brittle. "Of course. Right this way." He sat down. His daughter climbed into the window seat beside him and pressed her face to the glass, watching the ground crew load luggage below. Nobody clapped. Nobody welcomed him. They just stared. His name was Nathan Cole, 34 years old, a single father for the last 2 years, since his wife passed. He worked nights stocking shelves and mornings driving deliveries, and somewhere between those 2 jobs he'd saved every spare dollar for 11 months to give his daughter, Mia, the one thing she'd asked for on her birthday. "I want to see the ocean, Daddy, from way up high." That was it. That was the whole request. He didn't tell anyone what the ticket cost him. He didn't tell them he'd skipped his own lunch for 2 months to afford it. He just wanted, for 6 hours, for his daughter to feel like the most important passenger on the plane. Instead she felt the stares. A man in a gray suit 2 rows up muttered to his companion, "Not quietly enough. Some people just don't know where they belong." Mia's small shoulders dropped. She reached for her father's sleeve. Nathan didn't answer the man. He didn't even look at him. He simply took his daughter's hand and said, so only she could hear, "Ignore the noise, sweetheart. Watch the sky instead." The woman in 2A wasn't finished. When the flight attendant came around with warm towels, she leaned over the aisle and said, "Just for Nathan to hear, you know, they usually check to make sure people can actually afford these seats." Her husband chuckled. Nathan's jaw tightened, just slightly. He folded his hands in his lap and said nothing, but Mia had heard. She looked down at her rabbit and went quiet in the way children go quiet when they're trying very hard not to cry in public. That silence sat heavier in the cabin than any argument could have. A businessman across the aisle lowered his newspaper just enough to watch. He didn't say anything either, but he noticed something the others hadn't. The calluses on Nathan's hands, the way he checked his daughter's seatbelt twice before his own, the quiet patience in a man who had every reason to snap and didn't. The plane pushed back from the gate. The safety briefing played. Mia's hand found Nathan's again, and this time she whispered, "Are we going to be okay, Daddy?" "We're already okay," he said. "We're exactly where we're supposed to be." He didn't know how true that sentence was about to become. 20 minutes after takeoff, the intercom clicked on. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've reached cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. Skies are clear, and it should be a smooth ride into the coast." Ordinary words. Ordinary voice. But Nathan's back straightened just slightly, at something in the tone. A memory stirring somewhere he hadn't visited in years. He shook it off, told himself it was nothing. An hour in, the seatbelt sign switched off. The cabin door at the front of first class opened, and the captain stepped out. A broad-shouldered man in his 50s, silver at the temples, moving through the cabin to greet passengers the way captains sometimes do on quieter flights. He shook hands, exchanged pleasantries. The woman in 2A sat up a little straighter, ready for her moment of attention. Then the captain's eyes moved past her, and stopped, on Nathan. The color left the captain's face for half a second. Not fear, something closer to disbelief. He took one step closer, studying the man in seat 3C like he was looking at a ghost. "Sergeant Reyes?" The cabin went still. Nathan looked up slowly. Recognition broke across his face like sunrise. Captain Hall. Nobody in first class understood what they were witnessing. But they understood instantly that they had misjudged something enormous. The captain didn't sit. He didn't shake hands. He stepped back, squared his shoulders, and raised his right hand in a slow, deliberate salute. Right there in the aisle, in front of everyone. "Sir," the captain said, voice thick, "I wouldn't be alive to fly this plane if it weren't for you." The woman in 2A's mouth opened, then closed. Her husband set down his drink. Nathan stood, a little embarrassed, and returned the salute out of pure instinct. Muscle memory from a life he rarely spoke about. That was a long time ago, Captain. Not to me it wasn't. The story came out in pieces, the way important things often do. Not as a speech, but as fragments the captain couldn't hold back. 11 years earlier, in a transport helicopter over unforgiving terrain, a young pilot named Elias Hall had gone down hard. Mechanical failure, rough landing, a fire spreading fast along the fuselage. Sergeant Nathan Cole had been the only one close enough, and stubborn enough, to go back in. He'd pulled Hall out through a jammed door with seconds to spare, burned his hands doing it, never filed for recognition, never talked about it again. "I looked for you for years," Hall said. "Nobody could tell me where you'd gone. I went home," Nathan said simply. "Got married, had her." I nodded toward Mia, who was staring up at the captain with wide eyes. Things got quiet after that. The way I wanted them to. The man in the gray suit who'd made the comment about knowing where you belong was staring at his own hands now, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The woman in 2A had gone pale. "I didn't know," she said quietly, to no one in particular. "That's usually how it works," the businessman across the aisle said, not unkindly. He'd folded his newspaper completely now, watching the scene with something like reverence. Captain Hall crouched down to Mia's level. "Your dad," he said, "is the reason I got to grow old enough to have kids of my own. Did you know that?" Mia shook her head slowly, clutching her one-eared rabbit tighter. "He's the bravest man I've ever met." Hall stood and looked at Nathan. "And I don't say that to just anybody." Word moved through the cabin the way it does on a plane with nowhere else to go. By the time the flight attendants returned with a fresh round of service, something had shifted in the air itself. The woman in 2A quietly asked the attendant to bring over a bottle of champagne, not for herself but for Nathan and Mia. She didn't make a show of it. She simply set it down and said, "For the trouble earlier, I'm sorry." Nathan accepted it with a small nod, no lecture, no triumph in his eyes. Just quiet grace, the same grace he'd carried since he sat down. Captain Hall returned to the cockpit, but not before leaning down one more time. "When we land," he said, "there's a spot on the tarmac reserved for people who've earned it. I'd like to walk your daughter down the steps myself, if that's all right with you." Mia looked up at her father, eyes shining. "Daddy, can he?" Nathan smiled. The first full smile of the flight. "I think that'd mean a lot to her, Captain." Somewhere over the coastline, Mia finally got what she'd asked for. She pressed her face to the window as the ocean unrolled beneath them, endless and glittering, and gasped like it was the first beautiful thing she'd ever seen. Nathan watched her instead of the view. That was enough for him. It always had been. Behind them, the cabin that had once looked at him like he didn't belong, now watched him like he was the only person in first class who truly did. When the wheels touched down, applause broke out. Not the polite kind pilots sometimes get for a smooth landing, but something warmer, aimed squarely at the man in seat 3C who hadn't asked for any of it. Nathan Cole just held his daughter's hand, picked up her one-eared rabbit from where it had fallen, and walked toward the door. He didn't need the applause. He'd already gotten what he came for. The look on his little girl's face when she finally saw the ocean from way up high. Everything else was just the world. A little late, finally seeing him too.